When the war ended, the world should have breathed a sigh of relief. But in the smoke and ruin of 1945, something else began. A quieter race, fought not with bombs or bullets, but with brains. The victor stood among the ashes of the Third Reich and realized that Hitler's greatest weapons were not his armies or tanks, but his scientists. Men who had built rockets that touched the edge of space, jets that defied the sky, and chemical agents that had rewritten the rules of death itself. These were not soldiers. They were architects of annihilation, and both America and the Soviet Union wanted them. The operation that followed was called Paperclip. The name came from the small, ordinary metal clip attached to the files of those men the U.S. decided to save from prosecution and repurpose. It began as an act of desperation. The Allies had stormed into Germany expecting victory to give them power. Instead, they found laboratories decades ahead of their own. Jet aircraft, long-range missiles, prototype spacecraft, experimental nerve gases that could kill by a breath. A few floors beneath the ruins of Peenemünde and Nordhausen, they found the future, buried under rubble, soaked in blood. At the center of it all was a tall, charismatic engineer named Wernher von Braun. He was 33 years old, handsome, brilliant, and entirely unrepentant. Von Braun had designed the V-2 rocket, the first human-made object to reach the edge of space, and also the first ballistic missile used to kill civilians. His creations had rained down on London, killing thousands. Yet as American soldiers marched him into custody, he greeted them with a smile and an offer. "I want to build you rockets." They accepted. It was not patriotism that drove the Americans. It was fear of the Soviet Union. The Cold War had not yet begun, but its shadow was already lengthening. Both sides understood that whoever controlled rocket technology would control the future, not just in war, but in space, in communication, in dominance itself. And so, with the stroke of a pen, Operation Paperclip was born. Officially, it was a recruitment effort for scientific specialists. In reality, it was a moral surrender disguised as progress. The U.S. government authorized the transfer of more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. Many were members of the Nazi Party. Some were SS officers. A few had overseen forced labor camps where thousands had died building their machines. Their records were quietly rewritten. Their crimes were erased by paperwork. One intelligence officer later said, "We didn't just hire them, we baptized them." The first group arrived in 1945 under heavy secrecy. They were flown to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands, New Mexico, the perfect isolation for men who knew too much. There, under the desert sun, they began testing captured V-2 rockets. American soldiers watched in awe as the machines roared into the sky, higher and faster than anything they'd ever seen. The Nazi engineers became celebrities within the military. Von Braun quickly rose to prominence. He was charming, fluent in English, and utterly pragmatic. When asked about his past, he smiled and said, "My concern was always with the rocket, not the target." It was a clever lie. The camps that built his rockets, like Mittelwerk and Dora, had claimed more lives than his missiles ever did. Tens of thousands of slave laborers had died digging tunnels and assembling engines. Their bodies were buried in mass graves not far from the launch pads. But in America, none of that mattered. Von Braun and his team were given laboratories, funding, and freedom. They became the nucleus of the U.S. Army's rocket development program. Within a decade, they would build the Redstone missile, and eventually, the Saturn V, the rocket that carried humans to the moon. It's one of the great paradoxes of history. The same man who built Hitler's vengeance weapon also built humanity's vessel to the stars. In the East, the Soviets were doing the same. They captured their own share of German scientists, shipping hundreds to research centers near Moscow. Among them was Helmut Grottrup, von Braun's rival, who had worked on guidance systems for the V-2. Under Soviet direction, he helped design the early prototypes of the R-1 and R-2 missiles, the precursors to the R-7, which would launch Sputnik in 1957. Both superpowers, sworn enemies, owed their space programs to the same Third Reich laboratories. The ethical contradictions were staggering. The Nuremberg trials were still underway. judges sentencing Nazi leaders to death for crimes against humanity, even as the U.S. quietly rewrote the resumes of the men who had made those crimes possible. The Department of State initially opposed the program, citing moral and political risks. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply removed evidence of Nazi affiliations from personnel files. A few dissenting officers protested. One, a lawyer named Samuel Claus, said, "We are making ourselves accomplices to murderers." His objections were ignored. The Cold War demanded pragmatism. Pragmatism won. The new recruits were presented to the public not as former enemies, but as brilliant minds who had escaped the chaos of post-war Europe to help democracy triumph through science. Newspapers ran sanitized profiles. Von Braun appeared in glossy magazines, smiling beside sleek rockets and American flags. Disney even hired him as a television spokesman for space exploration, presenting him as a visionary who would take mankind beyond Earth. No one mentioned Dora. No one mentioned the dead. For America, Paperclip was a success story. Within 15 years, it had transformed the U.S. from a nation of airplanes and bombs to a superpower of missiles and orbiters. The scientists trained under Hitler had built the engines of deterrence, the nuclear-armed missiles that kept the Soviets at bay. But for the men themselves, it was a strange kind of purgatory. They lived comfortable lives in Alabama, New Mexico, and California, surrounded by families, church picnics, and Little League games. But they knew that beneath every launch pad lay ghosts. They knew the price of progress. Some rationalized it. They told themselves they had only ever been engineers, that politics was not their concern. Others, like Arthur Rudolph, could not escape their past. In the 1980s, long after the Cold War had cooled, U.S. investigators revisited his wartime record and found evidence of his role in the death camps. He was stripped of his citizenship and deported to Germany, a final, quiet reckoning. But by then, the damage was done. The rockets had already flown. The satellites had already gone up. Humanity had already touched the moon. Operation Paperclip had achieved its purpose and blurred the line between genius and guilt forever. What makes the story so haunting isn't just the hypocrisy. It's the realization that the entire modern world, from the International Space Station to intercontinental missiles, was built on foundations poured in the Third Reich. The technological miracle of the 20th century was born in the same cradle as its greatest atrocity. We like to imagine history as a moral staircase, each generation climbing higher. But Paperclip proved otherwise. Progress isn't always ascension. Sometimes it's excavation, digging through the ruins of evil to salvage what still works. The Americans told themselves they had rescued science from tyranny. The truth was darker. They had simply changed its employer. Von Braun became the face of America's space program. He gave speeches about peace and exploration, about humanity's destiny among the stars. But he never once publicly reckoned with the slaves who had died building his dreams. When a journalist asked him about it in 1960, he replied, "The rocket worked perfectly, it just landed on the wrong planet." It was meant as a joke. It wasn't funny. When Apollo 11 touched down on the moon in 1969, the world celebrated a triumph of mankind. But in the shadows of that triumph stood men who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler. Their fingerprints were on every bolt and circuit of the Saturn V. Their names were etched in the machinery of human history, both its glory and its guilt. The Cold War turned them into heroes. NASA's victory was propaganda gold. The Soviets had beaten America into orbit with Sputnik, but America had gone further, to the moon itself. The images of Neil Armstrong's footprint erased, for a time, the moral stains of the men who built the machine that took him there. But stains don't vanish. They sink. And beneath the surface of every photo of that shining rocket, every documentary about the space race, lies a simple truth. The line between salvation and sin is often drawn in blueprints. Operation Paperclip wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a mirror, one that reflected the uncomfortable face of humanity. It showed that progress has no conscience, that morality bends easily beneath the weight of necessity, and that every civilization, when afraid enough, will trade its soul for security. It's easy to judge from a distance. But ask yourself, if the survival of your nation depended on the mind of a man who built weapons for your enemy, would you refuse him? Or would you hand him a new uniform and tell him to keep building, only this time for you? That was the question America faced in 1945, and it answered yes. The consequences of that yes rippled through every part of modern life. Every GPS satellite, every ballistic missile, every spacecraft that leaves Earth, all trace their lineage back to the men of Paperclip. The Nazi dream of conquering the sky didn't die in 1945, it was simply absorbed into the American dream. The Cold War may have ended, but the technologies it birthed never stopped evolving. The missiles became rockets, the rockets became satellites. The satellites became the eyes that watch us now, silently orbiting the same planet the V2 once struck. In a way, the world we live in is Paperclip's final launch. Because when you inherit genius from evil, you inherit both. You can polish it, celebrate it, rename it, but you can't cleanse it. The ghosts stay welded into the steel. Operation Paperclip wasn't a footnote of the Cold War. It was the Cold War, the perfect symbol of its contradictions. Science used as salvation, morality traded for progress. Victory built on denial. The men who built Hitler's rockets lived long enough to see their inventions carry astronauts, satellites, and probes into the cosmos. Some even watched from their living rooms as humanity sent machines to other planets. For them, perhaps, it felt like redemption. For history, it was something else entirely, a reminder that brilliance and barbarism are not opposites, but neighbors. And as the stars reflected off the metal of the rockets they built, perhaps a few of them understood the truth they had spent their lives avoiding. That the only thing more dangerous than evil men doing evil things is good men deciding that evil is useful. Operation Paperclip, the scientists who built two superpowers, the story of how humanity reached the stars by crawling through the dark.